Dr. Denise McHugh is a very long-standing colleague of mine at the Open University, and we've worked together on various courses, particularly the Open University's Masters in History for several years. She's also very closely connected to Leicester Vaughan College, which is another terrific institution, adult education institution up in Leicester. And she is a consummate expert urban historian. Her last talk for us was on it was called Stink and Racket, which was about the smells and the noises of post-war British cities. But today she's taking a slightly different tack, and it's a slightly different chronology. So she's going back into the 19th century to a kind of a Kirsty and Phil for Victorian ex-colonials. Who knows where that's going to go, but I'm sure it's going to be terrific nonetheless. Denise, I'm going to hand over to you now if you would like to share your screen, and we will take it from there. Sit back and enjoy, everybody.
Thank you, Stuart. That's really kind. Can you all hear me okay?
There are nods.
Great. Okay, and you can see my screen, so we're all good. Okay, thank you so much, and hello, and welcome to this talk. As Stuart says, this is sort of going backwards a bit from my more recent work, but one of the nice things about being an urban historian is that we've got a certain freedom to roam around and do what we like in that sense. So this is a really good example of a piece of history or a piece of research that could have gone really unnoticed, and just an example of when you actually stop and think, what is that all about? How you end up digging up all sorts of things. So what I'm looking at is particularly people who at the height of the British Raj served in India and then came back temporarily often to live in Britain in between round about 1870 and sort of, I've run it up to the First World War, but there, you know, this applies up until about 1920 as well. So what happened was I was looking at, as an urban historian, I was looking at county towns and how they modernise, and I was doing a lot of census work, which is kind of how people try and assess the economy a bit. And I was particularly looking at the middle class because they tended to drive the provincial economy in the second half of the Victorian period. So I was trying to build a sort of an occupational and economic profile of a few county towns. And I found a lot of professionals in Bedford. And I just thought, oh, okay, you know, it's a county town, it's got admin, it's got solicitors, it's got these things. But when I had a closer look at them, there were a lot of army and naval officers. And I thought, well, army officers, okay, you know, county centre and everything. But the naval officers were a bit weird because if you know Bedford, you know it's got a river, but it's pretty much a really, really inland town. And when I had a closer look at the naval officers, a lot of them said that they actually worked in Bombay. So that was a bit kind of mystifying, and that made me look at other people in Bedford. And it's really difficult to look for particular people in the census just using occupation, because they had to be at home on the night that the census was taken, which was in April. And I had these naval officers that happened to be in Bedford in April, but it made me think, you know, they lived in households with children that were born in India, particularly in Bombay. And so I looked at other people born in India, and I found just over 600 people born in India living in Bedford in the 1871 census. And that kind of gave me an in to a certain amount of households. And then I tracked that over a time period and found that this remained fairly steady. So 40 years later, I've got 711 Bedford inhabitants born in India. So basically, I was like, well, this is really weird. This is just so odd. You know, I just couldn't. We'd all heard about people who worked in the Raj and they come home to Cheltenham, don't they, or Tunbridge Wells, and there's a kind of stereotype of these colonels that come home and they're really rich and they're grumpy, you know, and they have house with like weird bits of elephants in, and they complain a lot and then they die off. But this wasn't the picture that I had. I had lots of children and lots of teenagers. So really this was about the colonial class. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about terminology, because the particular community that I'd stumbled across and that I got interested in, they called themselves Anglo-Indians. They're not Anglo-Indian ethnically. They're white European people, predominantly English, you know, some Scots, some Irish, but predominantly people from England who were born in England, who went out to India to serve in the administration of India, in the British Army or the Indian Army under the British Empire in India, or in the various services administering the country and occupying the country. And in the period I'm looking at, they kind of had become increasingly mobile because the Suez Canal had opened, and they could take us. What you did if you were coming home from India was you sailed up the coast of India, you went up through the Gulf, you went through the Suez Canal, you got a steamship across the Mediterranean, and then you got a railway all the way to Calais from the south of Italy, and then you came home. And there were people who earned, so the men would go out at a young age and they would work in the services, and you didn't come home for 5 or 6 years, and then you would come home on leave for maybe 6 months at a time. And in that 6 months, you would hope to get married and form a family, or maybe get married and take a wife out to India, and then you had children. So it was about having a home at home in England, but at home in an England that you might not know very well and that you might not spend much time in. And this is where the whole house hunting thing gets complicated, because if you see yourself as British and predominantly English, and you work and live in India, and your whole career is structured around what the British are doing in India, where is your family home and where is your identity, and how do you make that work? You know, and we're talking about a time when, yes, there were trains, yes, there were telegraphs, yes, there were steamships, but nevertheless, you know, this is still maybe a 3 to 6 week journey, depending on how much money you had to come and go. So it's difficult. But they always referred to themselves, and particularly the civil service class, they always referred to themselves as Anglo-Indians. And by the time I'm finding them in Bedford, sometimes they're 3 or 4 generations in to this idea of being attached to, as they would call it, service in India, you know, because they come from these families. So it's a very long run tradition. So what I'm looking at here is the Indian officer class. So the Indian civil service, officers of the British and Indian armies, officers of the Royal Navy who are stationed in India, and senior staff of the medical, telegraph, railway, forest and engineering services. So what we might think of as the ruling elite, really. And we've also sort of mixed into that. We've got some commercial families, so some tea planters, some merchant families, you know, some people who are employed in trade. And when we think about this population, it's a really small group of people globally. David Gilmour, was for a long time the kind of predominant historian of the Raj, estimates that the entire population of India, administering India and running India in 1901, was just over 150,000. So less than the town of Hull, you know, spread out over the whole of the subcontinent. So it's a tiny global community. They're extremely elite. They're extremely highly educated. They're very tightly networked, and they're very mobile. But also, and most importantly, and coming back to the kind of Kirsty and Phil and house hunting situation, they're strapped. They're really short of money. So, you know, when you think about house hunting programs on television, it's always, what's the budget? And the budget was really, really bad. And the reason for this is that all of these people were essentially in some form of, on the whole, government employment. And the pay scales got fixed by about 1870. And they didn't really get significantly adjusted until the 1920s. Against the background of the British middle class at this point in time, getting much, much more wealthy. And at home here in Britain, we had inflation, very similar to the kind of inflation we have today. So they're in a difficult place with the money. And then there's a kind of double whammy, because when you were in service in India, you got paid in the local currency. So they were salaried men, but they were paid in rupees. And the rupee was attached to silver as its currency. It was underwritten by silver. And there was a crisis in silver in the 1870s. And the British pound was attached to gold. So the British pound remains stable and the rupee devalued. So for every £100 you earned in the last quarter of the 19th century on service in India, if you earned £100, it was only worth 62 in Britain. Added to that, the fact that Anglo-Indian people tended to have large families. If you were in India, if you located your wife and children in India, obviously the mortality rate was very high. You know, there's a lot of problems. So people lost children very young, even children that got... In Britain at this point, if you got your child to the age of 3, they were likely to survive. That's not a given in the British Indian population. So they had lots of children, you know, as a sort of an insurance policy, but also because they saw themselves as, they were people that really believed in the Raj. They really believed in the concept of Britain bringing civilization, however you feel about that, to the globe. And they wanted to sort of generate the next generation doing that. And they saw that to be their duty. So they had large families, they're strapped for money, they've got a very high need for space, for mobility, for education. They need to get these children into, if they're male, proper careers in India, and if they're female, married into the right sort of family. So they're under pressure. Now, if you are in the army or the navy, when you're at home on leave in Britain, for a portion of that time, you need to be within an hour of London because you could be called up. So, for example, if you're in the navy and you were recalled during your leave, you didn't have to go to the nearest ship or the nearest port, which might make sense to us. You went to the naval office in Whitehall. So you needed somewhere that had a good rail connection to London. So these are the people that I'm finding in Bedford, to my surprise. And I thought, what are they doing there? And the more I looked, the more I found them. And when I thought, well, okay, I've got all these people that've got children born in Bombay, let's have a look at how many families, how many records. And I had 277 census entries that featured Bombay in 1881. So that was either children born in Bombay or people who recorded their workplaces being in Bombay. Or maybe they were recorded as wife, medical officer, Bombay, and the medical officer wasn't there, but Bombay still features in the census record. So that suggests we've got a really tight clustering of a community who've kind of translocated. So they're doing this through networks of support and knowing people, very much as we might see migrant communities anywhere in the world in the 20th century. So we've got a hard core of people, and I just got fascinated with them, you know. So this is the kind of what would have been for the middle class a cheap house to rent. Bedford was expanding at the time, and the local property developers were building cheap houses, large, cheap, respectable houses designed to be rented out. And this is a very typical example. And Charles Linnell, who grew up in Edwardian Bedfordshire, said, our houses were large enough to accommodate an Edwardian number of young, and under their gables, the Anglo-Indians were trying to make ends meet with dignity. Our houses were crammed with Benares tables, little carved elephants, placid Buddhas, malevolent gods. Our mothers made good curries, which is perhaps not something you'd expect to be going on in suburban Britain, in families of sort of British people in suburban England, but there you go. Okay, so if you were house hunting and you were a member of the imperial officer class, what you need is large, cheap accommodation. You need some form of appropriate middle-class education for your children. And most importantly, this has got to be in a school that does exams for the services. So where your child can pass an exam to get into the civil service or pass an exam to get into the Forestry Commission. So basically, we're talking private education, not state education, and very male orientated. And lots of that imperial values, you know, so lots of rugby and rowing and outdoor activities. You also want quite a lot of services. So you want there to be the appropriate types of shops, telegraph offices, libraries, rail service up to London. You need to have lots of leisure amenities for the young people and also for the men when they come home on leave, because I'll talk a bit about that, but men on leave were generally regarded as a problem. Yeah. You wanted other people that were like yourself, and you wanted all of this on the cheap. So, you know, when you see the property programs and people want the moon on the stick and then they say they've got a very small budget, it's the same situation, really. So where do they go? This is the ideal. This is what the officer class lived in when they were out in India. This was called a bungalow. It might not look like a bungalow to us because it looks like several stories, but actually all the living is on one floor, on the first floor. And it's got big verandas and deep balconies to offer shade from the sun. And it's elevated, and that's to help it drain and to be healthy. So they're not all like this in British India, but there is a pattern emerging. And this really influences what British get used to when they're in India and what they kind of want when they come home to Britain as well. So first of all, if you are out in India and you're going to start house hunting, what do you do? How do you find out about what's on offer? And first of all, you know, you look at all the print media. This is a period in time when people who are living out in India, they do get the London papers. A lot of people are coming and going backwards and forwards all the time, traveling between Britain and India. You get all the media. It might be late, you know, it might be several months late. But as this excerpt shows, you know, people in the officer class in India, they didn't consider themselves to be out of the loop at all. They thought because they received all this media eventually, you know, and they got an awful lot of gossip. They had a lot of access to information. And then on top of that, they had a lot of specialist information. So this is quite interesting. This is a little, what we'd call today an advertorial that I found in Le Follet, which is a Paris fashion magazine. And you would kind of wonder why this would be in a Paris fashion magazine. And I strongly suspect, I can't prove, but I think this was probably paid for by Bedford estate agents because it's a real kind of bigging up estate agents. So it says, you know, that if it's Anglo-Indian to catch the eye, and it says, you know, most of the richer ones live in Bayswater. But if, however, you decide to live out of London, and you don't wish to be further from it than an hour and a half's journey, you could hardly do better than go to Bedford, where there are numerous Anglo-Indian residents. It has many exceptional advantages of various kinds. The schools of admirable character are very reasonable to residents. And this was a real clue, because if you lived within Bedford, the local charity supported particularly the boys' private grammar school, and you could get a reduction on the school fees. So there's a hint to that. And it says, you know, when you arrive in England, your best plan would be to go down to Bedford and put yourselves in the hands of an estate agent. But this is interesting in lots of ways, because first of all, you know, the estate agents are in on the act here. They're advertising in a fashion magazine, and it's obviously to get hold of the woman in the family, that she will tell the husband what to do. Oh, when you go home to England, you can go to Bedford and look at the houses there. Or when I go home to England, after I've had the baby, my sister and I will go to Bedford and have a look at the houses. So, you know, it's the kind of the female take on the economics here. And they know what they're doing in Bedford when they're advertising to these people. They're targeting their audience. So, as well as the kind of one-off bits of media in the newspapers and magazines, there were special publications. So, one of the funniest ones, from my perspective, perhaps just aged badly, is one called The Tropical Resident at Home, which is a whole handbook which tells you how to cope with the trauma of going back to Britain. You know, not everyone went back every 5-6 years. Some people have been out in India for maybe like 20 years. So they were really perhaps out of the loop. And it said that, you know, these Anglo-Indians, they fixed their tents in close proximity to each other. The problem with The Tropical Resident at Home is it does seem to have been written by someone who spent a lot of time in India. So it says, when selecting a house, whether for rent or purchase, there are 3 points to which you should pay special attention, namely 1, and water supply, 2, drainage, 3, ventilation, well, in British suburbia, these are not massive problems in the second half of the 19th century. That, as long as you're not living in a working class industrial zone, you're going to be good, and it also gets fixated on it's much better to live in an east-west street than north-south street because of the sun, which again, we live in Britain. We know that the sun is not a major issue. So it's quite warped like that. But there's an awful lot of printed material. There are advice and housekeeping guides. There are tourist handbooks. Each of the services, like the Army and the Navy, would produce a book telling you how to spend your leave that advised you where to go and what to do. And then we've got the estate agents' guides. And later on, by the 1920s, some town councils actually start sending out municipal guides, spend your retirement in Eastbourne and things like that. And then on top of that, people who came back and retired wrote autobiographies and memoirs. And these are often written in the format of offering people advice on how to cope with everything. Sorry, it's getting really dark. Just put the light on. Okay, so bearing in mind that leave was earned and that life in British India, okay, you're out there occupying and oppressing the local people maybe, but it was still quite difficult often, and individual members of the officer class could often work in, shall we say, circumstances of extreme isolation. You do get these memoirs where you've got a young man of sort of late 20s, early 30s, who's got 400 square miles of India to administer on his own, with just his Indian servants and a few horses, and he has to get on with it and, write his monthly report and make sure that there's no trouble and things like that. And on top of that, you've got the culture shock. And then, of course, you've got all the various things that you could catch, all the accidents that could happen. The mortality rates are quite bad. There was also a kind of a cultural idea in Britain and in British India that particularly British men had a certain type of constitution that was not really designed for tropical environments. And it was thought if you were properly British, the tropical environment was actually quite dangerous to you, and the dangers included, like, as they would say, going native, i.e. liking India too much, or learning the local language and getting too immersed, really. That's one. Or the other one was mental health issues. So they had this idea that they should be kept separate, and it's really part of that whole construct about being the ruling class. You've got a class of people that really buy into it, but they don't just think they should be kept separate in India. They do have an idea that they should be kept separate at home. So this is the Indian Civil Service Lunatic Asylum, as it was called, in Ealing. And this was a specialist institution for people who were in the services who had mental health issues, so that they wouldn't have to come home and mix with other people. They would be kept separate. So that whole ideology of separation follows all the way through. And that's quite important for when they're looking for housing in Britain. The location of this is also quite important because it was located out in suburbia. London didn't go as far as Ealing in those days, and that was thought to be a very calm environment. So if you read the guidebooks, things like The Tropical Resident and the guidebooks, they're very specific about the impact of environment on the British as they saw it. So some places were thought to be very bad for your nerves if you were home on leave and you were recuperating. So the guidebooks quite often say shouldn't go anywhere with dramatic landscapes. So the Peak District, and particularly Colwyn Bay, was specifically mentioned in one guidebook I read as being too exciting. If you came home to Britain, you should go somewhere very boring, and that would be good for your constitution and your nerves. So places like Cheltenham and Leamington Spa were deemed to be more suitable, i.e. much more bland. The problem is that Cheltenham and Leamington Spa are fashionable now, and they're probably a bit expensive for you. So to come back to the house hunting, you're looking for something cheap. So how do you spot a suitable habitat when you're house hunting? You look for other Anglo-Indians, you look for an appropriate landscape, preferably some medical facilities. You look for well-drained soil, cheap, roomy houses, low rates, lots of amenities. Public space was considered very important. The British, when they were colonising, did a lot of things in public. They liked to dominate the space. They liked to show, as they saw it, British superiority. They did, they did military displays. They did displays of technology. They did a lot of this. But also they did their private and personal socialising in public spaces, because often their houses were very basic and bare, and it was very socially difficult to host because you could kind of only host downwards in the hierarchy. It was difficult to host upwards. It was very hidebound by ritual and requirements. So it was much easier to meet people outside the home. So they were very used to doing this. So this is what they looked for. And obviously they looked for those good rail links. So this is the Saints development on the edge of Bedford that was built by Bedford businessmen, for example, the mayor, the person that owned the local newspaper, various property developments, particularly aimed at renting to middle-class service personnel. A lot of them are nursing homes today, but you can see the general scale of the houses. And you might be quite shocked to know that most Anglo-Indian families were so sort of strapped that basically when they were economizing, they economized on their British servants. So most of the families that I've identified in Bedford only would employ 2 or 3 teenage girls from, outside of the town. And as they got older and more experienced and more expensive, then they would leave to go to other jobs, or they would let them go and hire, another cheap 16-year-old. So they really were, in that sense, perhaps following the pattern of their colonial behaviours, if you like, back in British suburbia. And another way that they economised was to just keep one public-facing room. So this is actually an illustration from the Army and Navy catalogue. And this was labelled library reception room suitable for a captain. So the idea was you bought the whole thing on hire purchase. You could go to your local Army and Navy, you could arrange to have this delivered and pay it off over a number of years, which if you're on a fixed income made perfect sense, and you have one room that's respectable for receiving people in. And a lot of the memoirs do say things like, from children who were growing up, said, oh, we had orange crates in the bedrooms. We only had furniture on the ground floor. So the idea was to keep a hallway and a sitting room or front reception room that was respectable. And again, that would force you out into socializing in public. So going back to the idea of using the birthplace to identify these families and groups, I did this on a national level, but this is very much from kind of consolidated census returns, but there is a shift. So in 1851, this community preferred to live in London, Hampshire, basically around Portsmouth, Middlesex, Surrey and Devonshire. By 1891, London had become too expensive for them. You had to really be the elite to live in London. If you're at the officer level, you couldn't afford it. So it had fallen to 7th place. So, and you can see that Bedfordshire has come up, and they're all living in Bedford, really. Surrey, Sussex are featuring, and Devonshire again. And the Sussex and Devonshire show the development of the seaside resorts as places of residence. So seaside resorts across the end of the 19th century are changing from places that you just go on holiday to places that you actually live in. And the Anglo-Indian service community are really pioneering this. They're always on the lookout for a cheaper, more healthy seaside resort with a fast train and preferably a good hospital. So health, leisure and respectability are what they're looking for. This is St. Leonard's in Hastings. Some people might recognise it. And on the right-hand side, we have exactly what else they wanted. The Eversfield, this was became the Eversfield Chest Hospital. It started off as an extremely expensive private hospital and became specialising in chest and tuberculosis type illnesses. And this was at the top of a cliff. It had so lots of fresh air, and you can see that upper veranda and balcony so that the patients could be wheeled out into their beds, to get the fresh air. And this was exactly the kind of thing that this officer class were looking for if they came home unwell. So just having a little look at Hastings, using that, where were people born? We've got in 1911, 735 colonial-born inhabitants. And this is different to Bedford. In Bedford, we've got wives, we've got husbands home on leave, and we've got whole families. But in Hastings, I mainly found wives and widows, and they're listed as widows. Most of the women were over 30, so there's no marriage market. You're not going to Bedford on your leave in the hope of meeting somebody. Most significant, a third of the males were under 20. So this is mothers with children. And it's interesting because the town had 3 hospitals as well as being a seaside resort. And there was a particular emphasis in the beginning of the 20th century in Hastings for the hospitals to be specialising in childhood illnesses and then onto sort of particular illnesses. So there's a real specialisation of service there. So Hastings is here on the brink of changing from being a seaside resort with a season to an all-year residential and health centre. And I think from my perspective as an urban historian, it kind of shows that the impact that these people could have and how they could drive, even though they're not a huge group, they can drive the delivery of certain services. Okay, so to come back to the house hunting, when people in this class particularly men, started to look for a home back in England, they looked at the point when their eldest son was 7, because that was the point at which they wanted the boys to go into British education. So up until that point, you could probably manage pretty well on your money because you could live well on the salary in India. But this is the point at which they decide to repatriate and set up some sort of a household in Britain. And they're really looking at what there are in terms of amenities for children. So schools, Bedford had a subsidised, as I said, a grammar school that was subsidised by a charity, and it had these very suitable estates, very clean environment. The subsoil was gravel, which the Anglo-Indians really liked, and very suitable for bringing up small children. It also had a large river area, embankment, and a new park that the town council was developing. And this gave a lot of room for leisure. So particularly school rowing regattas were a big deal. But here you can see that the river's frozen and everyone's ice skating. Bedford also had a roller skating rink by the end of the 19th century that was said to be very popular. And if you read people's memoirs who went to school and grew up in this community in Bedford, they always said it was very popular because you got to hold hands with someone of the opposite sex. But it's also a good example of how this community embraced new leisure activities. They were very keen on leisure for health and for discipline and for community. And it's a good example of that. Another thing that men did in Bedford was to go out with the local packs of hounds because they couldn't afford to keep a horse, but they could, in Bedfordshire, you could hunt with hounds on foot. So again, that was an appeal. Now, I said earlier that men were considered to be a problem. And they were considered to be a problem. If you think about it, you're a woman who's come home with your 7 or 8-year-old son. You've got him settled into school. You've got smaller children. You have to do a lot of domestic labour that you didn't have to do in India because, let's face it, the servants are only teenagers and you've got to tell them how to do everything. Money is tight. You've got it all sorted out. Maybe you've got a lodger. This was very normal to have a lodger from your own community or from your extended family living with you. Perhaps somebody else who'd come home on leave, or a woman that you knew in India who'd come home to have a baby. So the household is rammed with people. And you've got everything running perfectly. And you really, really, really want your husband to come home on leave because you haven't seen him maybe for a year or 2. And then he does come home on leave. And that's very nice. And then he's bored, apparently, and you've got him for 6 months and he hasn't got anything to do. And, you know, you're stuck with him. And the main thing that it says in these advice to women is do not let your husband go to London. Because if he goes to London, he will go to a men's club, and those men's clubs are expensive. And then when they get there, they start gambling. And then the next thing is all the chaps in the men's club decide to go to the races, and then he'll be spending really big money. So there's a lot of this idea that men have to be somewhat confined into improving activities that don't cost anything, you know, and this is another advert for moving to Bedford. And it says that, you know, in the neighbourhood of London, the unfortunate, here they're talking about retired officer, can find himself with no companionship to his taste during the day. This is not the case in Bedford, where birds of a feather have flocked together. And it says that, you know, this chap will be able to find kindred spirits to play golf, bridge or row or do whatever he has a mind to. So it's how to occupy chaps in a cheap manner, basically. And this was the solution. This is the Bedford Town and Country Club. It'll be no surprise to you to know that this was invested in by the same people locally who invested in the big cheap houses and also the high street shops. And you could buy shares in this. And this is on the lines of a London private club. And it's just designed for middle class male leisure. But, you know, Anglo-Indians were known by other people to be miserable. You know, this is somebody's memoir from 1867. He says, it is a popular opinion that the retired Anglo-Indian is the most miserable of human beings. And there is no doubt that, you know, there was a lot of misery. You know, people became very attached to their lives in India. A lot of them were, it's very easy to poke fun at this community. It's very easy in the post-imperial age to think of them purely as occupiers and oppressors, which of course, in the greater scheme of things, they were. That was the system. Individually, they often had quite miserable lives, lots of loss of children, loss of wives, lots of family partings, you know, lots of never seeing people again, endless letters going back and forwards, photographs going back and forwards, women having to decide whether to stay in England and not see their husbands or send their child home and not see their children. You know, there are families kind of ripped apart. It's one thing to look at the big scale and it's another thing to look at the small scale, you know, and one of the things that compounds the misery is the being poor and looked down upon in Britain. And particularly as our period went on, you know, the British started to lose, the average British public by 1920 had really gone off the idea of having India as a colony. One of the ironies is that some of the most ardent home rulers you could find and people in favour of Indian independence were actually in the administration of India. You know, and they come back to Britain and try and convince other people that this should be the case. And they say, well, nobody wants to listen to us. We know all about India. Nobody wants to listen to us. And people didn't want to listen to them. They weren't interested. But from the perspective of the locals, for example, in Bedford, they thought that these people were terribly snobby. And they were terribly snobby. And they also thought they were boring. And they didn't talk about anything but India. And they were quite up themselves. And all of that was true as well. So there was a big cultural gulf. You know, because the British middle class had turned into something different while these people were in India and they felt unappreciated. And, you know, from the perspective of the local middle class, they were a bunch of snobs who wouldn't mix with anyone. And both of those things were true. You know, it's a kind of a clash. So maybe we don't have to feel sorry for them as a class, but individually sometimes you end up feeling kind of quite sad, you know, because sometimes it's kind of quite sad stories of you know, family separation, and anyone who's read Rudyard Kipling's childhood memoir would know what I mean. So what impact do they have on a local level? Well, we've seen the big estates, we've seen the parks, we know that they kind of dominated the schools, but also they have an impact commercially. So this is, again, from the Army and Navy catalogue, and it shows what you could buy, you know, from the comfort of your own home or in a shop in Bedford. Bedford had Army and Navy shops, and so did lots of other places that we might expect to find Anglo-Indians. For example, the Our Boys and Our Girls shops, also sold complete, as they would call it, complete kits for India. So a whole trunk full of stuff that you might need. And this kind of re-emphasized, I suppose, or reinforced the strangeness and the difference of this group of people. This is a Bedford doctor who wrote his memoir in the 1950s and said the squatters, that was what the locals called them, the squatters, because they weren't necessarily there forever, was very exclusive, not to say snobbish. Besides the officers at the barracks, only a few of the leading doctors, clergymen and lawyers were admitted. And then they go on to be very sarcastic and say that every morning between 11 and 12:30, there was a regular parade of admirals, generals, colonels and other officers up and down the high street. Now, I know this is sarcasm because I went very carefully through the census returns and there were absolutely no admirals, generals living in Bedford. So basically what they're saying is they thought they were big, but they're, you know, they're the middle layer. They're not who they think they are, and we don't have to be impressed by them. On their part, I read a memoir written by an Anglo-Indian who said, oh, we all went away in August and you could have fired a cannon down the high street and not hit anyone. But funnily enough, all the locals did not go away in August, and all the markets and the cattle marts and things like that were still on in the high street. So by not hit anyone, they meant one of us and not one of them. So, you know, this is a kind of an isolated community within a community to a certain level. And this is the kind of Belle Epoque environment that they were looking for. So this is Bedford Park, and this is the central avenue. But it could be Paris, it could be a seaside resort, it could be anywhere that's set up for affluent, leisured living and mingling and display and seeing and being seen. And this is really what you're looking for on your house hunting. You're looking for somewhere like this. Okay, so if, like me, you kind of fell down this hole and decided that this was quite interesting, and it's interesting to identify these highly mobile communities, how could you find them? First of all, looking at birthplaces in the census, if you do census work, is very, very revealing. And you can also check occupations, but again, you know, it's really messy doing occupations. For example, army captain tells you next to nothing unless there's anyone else, you know, even if the army captain's at home on census night, unless there's anything else that the census taker wrote down, you're kind of at the mercy there. In terms of field work, look at house and road names, because it's amazing how these people do live in houses called things like Simla Bungalow, even when they're living in a three-story Edwardian house in the 1920s suburbia. You know, they try and get road names changed, particularly to glorify empire. They tend to favour houses with verandas and balconies, even in Britain, and people who are deliberately trying to rent them and target them put little balconies on houses to rent out. You can look at trade directories for and guides for specialist shops, a bit like the Army and Navy, things I've shown you. You can look at inscriptions in graveyards and cemeteries and check historic institutions. And also just reading monuments and memorials will give you an idea of the presence of these people. So if you want to do some field work in your local area, those are just things that you can look out for. And this is really the why should we care? As I say, this very small group of people, you know, we could say they were going in the wrong way with history, if we like. You know, they're on the wrong side of history, definitely. So, you know, what's the significance of them? So what? I think they're interesting because they utilize networks created by their time abroad, by their occupation, by their knowledge networks. For example, all the naval officers that I found in Bedford were nearly all medical ones. So they weren't just naval officers, but they were connected by medical knowledge. And one of the reasons they wanted to be in Bedford was access to London hospitals and Bedford Hospital, which was very, very modern at the time. They had a lot of institutional and colonial sociability, which they transferred, you know, back across continents. they really maintained family and service networks very, very tightly. They continued what we might think of as colonial behaviours back in Britain. So if we're trying to think about the impact of empire in suburban and provincial Britain, outside of London, these are the people that we could look at. Interestingly, these behaviours are migrant behaviours. We will find these behaviours in other migrant communities as well. So they're not that weird, you know, despite the ethnic difference, if you like, and despite the fact that they were supposed to be at home, you know, they are essentially displaying migrant and immigrant strategies against loneliness or against loss of occupation and having a stretched income. I think in lots of ways they pioneered modern suburban living. They were mad keen on technology and gadgets. You know, they were great compared to the kind of bourgeois or commercial middle class in Britain at this point in time. They were early adopters of all technology. They were really keen on electricity. They were really keen on transport. They were really keen on education. They were really keen on things like modern surgery and medicine. They were mad for gadgets. I think, you know, if you'd been in the market to sell gadgets, you could have sold gadgets to any of these chaps home on leave. You know, they really uptake things and try things out. Another reason for that is they're always trying to save themselves labour, you know. But they demanded from the localities a lot of modern services. It must have been a bit of a nightmare if you'd been running the municipality and these people arrived, you know, and clustered together, because the first thing they did was they were always writing to the local government board, my town council's rubbish. And, you know, they always wrote to their cousin in Whitehall or something. They had their own systems and, you know, but at the same time, they supported services, leisure, education and health services. So they did develop places. And I think they're just kind of weird and fascinating. They have some terrible attitudes and they have some very modern attitudes. They have some really bizarre and, frankly, for want of a better word, wrong ideas. But equally, they have some kind of values that we might be able to identify with and see as really survival strategies in a world that was changing around them, that they didn't necessarily have great tools to adjust to. Okay, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Denise. That was absolutely splendid stuff. What a terrific piece of research, drawing on lots of different sources there.